Hello, hello, hello. I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe, and you're on vlmd Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. Welcome. Today's topic wasn't really on my list, but when I looked at what was on my list, I realized it would make more sense to talk about this first before I got to that topic. And that's why today we will be talking about HDL. And this also means, since I didn't quite plan it, that I will be winging it again. It's getting to be a bit of a habit, right? Well, it was a very busy week, very busy weekend. And so I have just managed to scribble down some notes, and I probably won't use all of them. I don't want to cram too much into one episode. Maybe better to leave some of it for a future time. So today, my plan is just to get through some of the basic aspects of HDL and leave maybe the more interesting aspects for a different time. And this way, we'll get that out of the way and it will be a good prep for the next episode. All right, so let's go. HDL, high density lipoprotein. We've talked about them before. I did my lipoprotein episode, and of course I mentioned HDL there. And we generally think of HDL as the good cholesterol, that it's cardioprotective, and at least, a while back, most times people wanted to raise the HDL levels in their patients. So if you're a woman, you wanted the HDL-C to be greater than 50. If you're a man, then you wanted it to be greater than 40 because it was felt to be cardioprotective. Now, HDL has been well preserved throughout evolution. The interesting thing about it is that in species that don't really have atherosclerosis, that don't really have heart disease, you still have HDL, which means, it might be there for different reasons. We're used to thinking of it in the cardioprotective, point of view. But again, there are species that really don't have heart disease. So why would they have preserved HDL? So let's look at some other functions of HDL today. But before we do, let's go back to this whole idea of the higher your HDL-C levels, the better. Well, it turns out it's a little bit more involved than that. Generally, there's actually a U-shaped curve when it comes to HDL levels, so that at very low levels, yes, you have greater risk for cardiovascular events, but at very high levels, you also have increased risk for cardiovascular events, right? So it's a U-shaped curve. And what's very high? Well, that would be in the range of anything greater than 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. So higher than that, you were actually at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And there've been trials using drugs to try to raise HDL-C when we thought that the higher the levels, the better. And it turned out that actually just made things worse for the patients. Now, there's also a U-shaped HDL-C association for infectious and autoimmune disease. So that if you had very low HDL-C, then you had increased risk of infection and also autoimmune disease. But very high levels put you at increased risk of infectious disease. And I mentioned, drugs that raised HDL levels. Well, there was a trial using a drug called torcetrapib. Okay, let me just go off on a tangent here. Torcetrapib. Who names these drugs? Seriously, I just kind of wonder. One day I'd like to meet the people who name these drugs. And in my head, I think it's some frustrated fantasy writer who, he's writing about torcetrapib, the dragon slayer, late at night. And then his day job is to name these drugs. And so that's what we get. All right, sorry for the rant, but I just hate these names. All right, so torcetrapib was used to try and raise HDL-C levels. It's a cholesterol esterase transfer protein inhibitor, and this would then raise the HDL levels in the person using this drug. And it turned out that actually these people died more of cardiovascular disease, also of cancer, and of sepsis, right? So they had increased risk of infection and sepsis compared to the controls. So this kind of shocked everyone because up to that point, everybody thought the higher your HDL, the better, but not so. Now, I talked about autoimmune disease. So if you look at things like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, these are generally associated with dyslipidemias, right? So for example, lupus, you'll have increased levels of VLDL, increased LDL, and also you had low HDL-C. And this is also true, the low HDL. You'll see that also in rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis, Crohn's. Okay, so these autoimmune diseases, you see the similarities there where they have low levels of HDL, especially, let's say something like Crohn's, when the patient is having flares of colitis at that point. All right. So we started to realize at that point that, maybe it's not quite so simple. These patients with autoimmune disease, they have modifications in the HDL composition and function that led to these HDL particles going from anti-inflammatory to a more pro-inflammatory profile. So we have these acute phase reactants, mostly produced by the liver. You'll hear me talk about them a little bit today. And these are just proteins, these acute phase reactants, produced by the liver generally when you have infection or inflammation in the body. And they sort of help your body prepare towards a more pro-inflammatory profile to help you fight infection. Okay, so one of these acute phase reactants is something called serum amyloid A, SAA, serum amyloid A. And in, again, inflammation, you have increased levels of this serum amyloid A produced by the liver, actually also by macrophages, my favorite cells, all right? These are immune cells, and we'll talk a bit more about them also today. So with these autoimmune diseases, there is displacement of ApoA1, which is generally the protein that you find in HDL. Again, you can go back to the lipoprotein episode because I talk about it more there. But we'll have actually displacement of ApoA1 in the HDL by this acute phase reactant, the serum amyloid A. And therefore, you'll also have decreased antioxidant ability in that HDL. Okay, so now we have more inflammatory HDLs, and these actually have lower cholesterol ester content, higher triacylglycerol content, decreased phospholipid content as well. And actually, that kind of profile we also see in the case of someone having an acute myocardial infarction, right? A heart attack at the time. These inflammatory HDL particles, they have phospholipids that are more of the omega-6 content, so more arachidonic acid versus the protective omega-3s, right, which specifically the DHAs. And this actually affects the ability of HDL to traffic cholesterol out from the periphery and bring it back to the liver, right? We call that ability its cholesterol efflux capacity, or CEC, cholesterol efflux capacity, because the whole idea, again, we talked about it in the lipoprotein episode of the HDL, is that it's able to remove cholesterol from the periphery, including the artery walls, and bring it back to the liver and eventually for excretion, all right? But we have these HDL species in autoimmune disease that don't function well in removing cholesterol because now they are actually more inflammatory and are not able to do their jobs. And in actual fact, in the case of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, there have been studies using a drug called, get ready, torsilizumab, the lizard slayer. Actually, no, it's an interleukin-6 inhibitor. Yes, there we go with the names again. Torsilizumab, an interleukin-6 inhibitor. Actually, so if you inhibited that inflammatory cytokine, you improved the efflux capacity, cholesterol efflux capacity of the HDL, right? So proving that concept that in those autoimmune diseases, if you changed the pro-inflammatory atmosphere or environment, then you would actually improve the HDL function. Okay, now HDL has actually, besides its cholesterol efflux capacity, many anti-atherogenic properties. For one, it's an antioxidant. It's got lots of enzymes that have antioxidant effects on them. And it's also good for regulation of vascular tone and has effects on immune cells. Now, this ability of HDL to remove free cholesterol from the cell membrane is important. And again, back in the lipoprotein episode, we talked about this. It's mediated by specific transporter proteins, right? The ATP binding cassette transporters, or ABCA1, ABCG1. And we also have some pathways that are independent of those transporters. We have these paraoxonase enzymes, paraoxonase, paraoxonase enzymes. We just simply call them PON, PON, all in caps, PON 1 to 3, because, you know, they're different enzymes. And these give the antioxidative properties to the HDL. So PON1, for example, is important for regulation of vascular tone by activation of eNOS, or endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And when we have more nitric oxide produced by eNOS, then we have more relaxation of the blood vessel walls, more dilation, right? And that's good for the blood vessels. There's also inhibition of endothelial adhesive molecules and decrease in apoptosis and increase in repair of endothelial cells, Okay, so the good effects of PON1 are seen in the HDL, and actually with lupus, for example, again, as an autoimmune disease, we have decrease in that paraoxinase activity. And so, again, you have that more inflammatory profile for the HDL there. All right, now HDL is also involved in inflammation. So we've known for a long time, actually, I think since the mid-90s, that it's able to bind to LPS through LPS binding protein, so LPS from gram-negative bacteria, and also to LTA or lipoteichoic acid from gram-positive bacteria, right? That actually goes back a long way, but more recently in 2021, there was an article in Science by Han et al. And they basically looked at intestinal HDL. And this intestinal HDL was found to travel up the portal vein to the liver. And what it did was it was bound to LPS binding protein, and any LPS from gram-negative bacteria was bound also to that LPS binding protein. And this prevented the LPS, when it got to the liver, prevented the LPS from activating the immune cells there, specifically the liver macrophages, right? And, that meant that we didn't activate an inflammatory profile in the liver, causing damage and fibrosis to the liver. So the HDL was protective in that in the intestines already, where, we could encounter LPS from the gut bacteria, right? It had bound to LPS binding protein, which would then bind to the LPS and not allow this LPS to damage the liver as it traveled to the liver via the portal vein. Okay, so this was exciting news because then they felt like, oh, we actually have this species of HDL that is protective against inflammation. It's a bit of an old story, but yeah, maybe a little bit more detail here. And when I told this to my patients, one of them was quite happy and said, hey, so I have a lot of HDL particles, and so that's protecting me from LPS. And I said, well, you have a lot of the large HDL particles, and this is actually HDL subspecies 3, which is actually the small, dense HDL. So maybe not. And as you can see, these details matter, right? The more we talk about HDL, you're going to realize things are going to get murkier and murkier. All right. Now, and HDL also can promote the production of PTX3. This is another acute phase reactant, this one produced by endothelial cells. And it has important roles in infection, but also in atherosclerosis, in thrombosis, and even in obesity. So again, very much involved with these acute phase reactants. All right, let's specifically look at HDL and its involvement with the immune system here. So we'll start by noting that there's a lot of free cholesterol in plasma membranes, right? I think most of us know this. There are specific domains in the plasma membrane called lipid rafts. And these lipid rafts are especially enriched with cholesterol. And, we have a lot of these lipid rafts kind of spread out throughout the plasma membrane. And they make up about 30 to 40% of mammalian membranes. These lipid rafts are really important because they serve as platforms for proteins involved in signal transduction and also for spatial organization, for favorable kinetic interactions between different proteins, okay? So it's like this little platform where protein interactions can happen and signal transduction can happen. Now, these lipid rafts, as I said, are enriched with cholesterol, and that cholesterol content is very important in immune responses. So if we're looking at the innate immune system, right, we have toll-like receptor 4 or TLR4. I discussed that in the innate immunity episode, right? And this is part of the PAMPs and DAMPs. And these are basically, receptors that recognize certain pathogen patterns or damage patterns from cells and then signal to start an inflammatory process, okay? The TLR, the toll-like receptor 4 is like one of the most famous of those receptors. And this can sense LPS. And when it does so, these TLR4s will start to cluster in the lipid rafts, right? They're generally kind of scattered throughout the membrane, but once it senses LPS, you'll see that they start to cluster in the lipid rafts. Now, if we have macrophages, for example, cells of the innate immune system, right? And they are deficient in the ABCA1, transporters, for example, then they have a lot of free cholesterol in their membranes, and this will lead to increased expression of inflammatory proteins and cytokines and chemokine genes in response to the LPS, because now we have a lot of the TLR4s clustering in these abundant lipid rafts in the membrane. And actually, if you deplete the cell of cholesterol, you dampen the response. So for the innate immune system, it's really important that cholesterol provide the structure for these lipid rafts so that the TLR4 receptors can cluster and clump and then signal appropriately to start the inflammatory response, okay? That's with the innate immune system. Now, if we look at the adaptive immune system, we also see the importance of cholesterol here. And what happens is that when the T cell receptors are stimulated with antigens, they are then going to associate with lipid rafts. Remember, they have to cross-link or cluster together to lead to signaling and T cell proliferation. I did that in the adaptive immune system episode, so you can go back and check that one out too. Well, ApoA1 and HDL, right? By removing cholesterol from the membrane and from the lipid raft portions, they are able to modulate the abundance of lipid rafts and therefore help modify this T cell response and also the innate response, okay? So you can see that HDL and ApoA1, the protein part of HDL, are important here because just by changing the cholesterol content in the cell membrane, we're going to change the abundance of the lipid rafts. And so these receptors cannot cluster. The TLR4s in the innate system and the T cell receptors, for example, in the adaptive system, they can't cluster. And so that's going to actually dampen their signaling, right? And, we don't have that huge immune response. And that's why HDL can be very important in immunity. All right, at this point, I want to go a little bit more to macrophages, my favorite cells. And I didn't do an episode specifically on macrophages, but I have a talk I gave that's floating around on YouTube. It's called the Magical Mystery Macrophage Tour. And if you search that in YouTube, you'll find it. And that gives you a pretty general, very basic overview of macrophages. They're really important, I think, in the development of many chronic diseases. Okay, so that's a pretty superficial take on macrophages, but it's a fun ride, right? So if you have time, go look at that one. You probably should do another follow up to that another time. But today, let's just look at macrophages. And, macrophages, they are able to form free radicals. And that's really important in the defense system because, these free radicals can be generated to destroy pathogens, bacteria, viruses that are invading. Okay. So that's part of their sort of defense system. Okay. Now they generate hydrogen peroxide in the membrane. Now this is technically not a free radical, but it is a producer of radicals, right? It's part of that system. So these macrophages can generate hydrogen peroxide, but they also are producers of something called myeloperoxidase, okay, or MPO, myeloperoxidase. And what myeloperoxidase can do is convert the hydrogen peroxide to hypochlorous acid or bleach, okay? And that bleach is very effective in killing pathogens. So as I said before, yeah, your body makes its own bleach. Please don't drink any, but yes, your body does technically make a little bit of bleach to kill pathogens. All right, so you have in these macrophages, right, the MPO now forming this bleach product. Well, the thing with that bleach product is that it's damaging to pathogens, but it can be damaging to tissues in your body, and it can be damaging to your lipoproteins as well. So they can actually modify the ApoA1 part of HDL. And when they do that, they will actually block its ability to remove cholesterol from cells. All right, so we need the ApoA1, again, back to the lipoprotein episode. We need the ApoA1 to help remove cholesterol from the cells, right? But this MPO will actually be able to modify the HDL by the formation of this hypochlorous acid. And that will block parts of the ApoA1 and prevent it from removing cholesterol from cells. So this means that when you have activated macrophages and they're producing, a lot of hypochlorous acid, you are also at the same time preventing HDL from removing cholesterol from them. And now we get the accumulation of cholesterol within the macrophages, and that will exacerbate the formation of what we call foam cells that you see in atherosclerosis. Okay, so I hope you're beginning to see now that it's not simply, how high your HDL-C levels are. It's not, really just looking at even how many particles of HDL you have, but we have to start thinking about the function of HDL. And now we're realizing that dysfunctional HDL may be playing a huge role in inflammation and even in atherosclerosis. Okay, so in a paper by the Heineke lab. This was by Shao and Heineke in Expert Review of Proteomics 2018. What they did was they analyzed HDL proteins by mass spec, and they just wanted to look at the different proteins on HDL compared to LDL. LDL doesn't have really a lot of proteins, right? But HDL is really kind of hard to study because the protein content in HDL is just really hard to categorize and classify. So they took on a big task and they decided to analyze HDL proteins by mass spec. And what they found were these, four categories generally of proteins. Now, there was a category that was primarily involved in lipid metabolism. That's no surprise. We think of HDL in terms of, lipid and cholesterol metabolism and efflux, right? So we have a cluster that is involved with lipid metabolism. But we also have these proteins that are proteinase inhibitors, and these may be involved in, let's say, plaque rupture and clot formation, right? So those are a different cluster of proteins on HDL. And then we have a cluster of acute phase reactant proteins on HDL, big cluster. And that cluster of acute phase reactants actually a little bit larger number than the proteins involved in lipid metabolism. And then we had a fourth cluster of proteins that were involved with the regulation of complement. Okay, so if you remember from the innate immune system episode, I did talk about complement activation. So now we had proteins that were also involved with that whole complement system on HDL. So you can see that the lipid metabolism was just one cluster, and that wasn't even the largest cluster. The largest cluster of proteins were those acute phase reactant proteins. And then we had also a lot of the proteinase inhibitors, but we also had a lot of the complement proteins as well. So now we realize that actually these HDLs are so diverse, and rather than think about the lipid species on them and think about the cholesterol on them, which is generally how they are discussed, we perhaps should be more focused on the proteins that are on them. Incidentally, there's a study here by Gordon et al. From Molecular Cell Proteomics 2015. And I thought this was interesting because they looked at statins. Statins are known to lower LDL. That's generally why we use them. And people have felt that that's what made them cardioprotective. But this study actually asked the question of what statins did to HDL. Now, that's a new one. I love that because, we're always focused on LDL. And what Gordon et al. Did was just ask the question of, well, what about HDL? What happens when you give statins to someone? What happens to their HDL? So what they did was they looked at people pre and post statin medication, right? Before they started statins and after they started statins, they primarily looked at their HDL to see what would happen. And there was a huge change pre and post statin use, okay? So it turned out that the HDL proteome changed greatly. There was a big change. For the large HDL, there was a greater than 20-fold increase in alpha 1 antitrypsin. Okay, so alpha-1 antitrypsin is part of what we call a serpin family, the serine protease inhibitor family. Don't worry about that. It's generally, just think of it, it is an acute phase reactant again, okay? So we have this alpha-1 antitrypsin, an acute phase reactant. And what it does is it inhibits something called neutrophil elastase. And this is something that we get from activated neutrophils. Remember, go back to the innate immunity episode. I do talk about these killer neutrophils there and how they can cause a lot of destruction. Well, they produce this stuff called neutrophil elastase, right? And this can destroy tissue. So this alpha-1 antitrypsin inhibits neutrophil elastase. Now we also see this neutrophil elastase in activated macrophages in atherosclerotic plaques. All right, and this means that we degrade a lot of the extracellular matrix there, which can lead to plaque rupture. That's why it's important there. So now after they gave statins to these people in the study, we saw a great increase in the alpha-1 antitrypsin levels in the large HDL. And what happened is that this alpha-1 antitrypsin, when it binds to HDL, it actually loses its anti-elastase activity. Okay, that's not good, because in the first place, it's helpful because it inhibits the elastase and therefore the degradation of the extracellular matrix, right? But now you're saying, okay, when it's bound to HDL, it loses that anti-elastase activity. But, so it gets complicated here, in the presence of hydrogen peroxide, which means in a pro-oxidant environment, right? A highly inflammatory environment, it actually doesn't become inactivated when it's bound to the HDL, right? Normally it would, but when it's in a pro-oxidant environment, like in the plaque, it's actually still going to maintain its function and not be inactivated, so that, you know, it's actually protective in that pro-oxidant environment and may help stabilize the plaque. Also, HDL-bound alpha-1 antitrypsin decrease macrophage activation. So now we didn't actually have macrophages activated as much towards a pro-inflammatory profile. So here we can see that changing HDL protein composition by statin use may actually contribute to cardioprotective effects that have been ascribed to it. And we've always just kind of said, oh, it's from lowering the LDL. But here we're seeing that it's through the HDL, and how when you change the protein composition in the HDL, you may have different effects, and some of them may be cardioprotective. So I thought that was just quite an interesting study there. And we see that the HDL proteome actually changes in different diseases, such as renal disease. For example, you may have more ApoC3 present there in patients with renal disease. You'll see that patients with diabetes also have different expressions of proteins on their HDL. So you're starting, hopefully, to get the picture that it's the protein composition and content on the HDL that might be important in its function and in whether it's cardioprotective or not, and in whether it's inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. Du et al. In Circulation Research in 2015 also pointed out, and there are other studies that show this, that the small dense HDL, again the subspecies HDL3b and 3c, that are the most actually cardioprotective because they are potent acceptors of cholesterol from macrophages via the ABCA1 pathway, right? So we know that besides this study, there are other clinical trials that showed that drugs that raise large HDL really didn't do anything. And it really needed to be the small, dense HDLs that were protective, okay? So again, it's not just, HDL. There's no kind of fixed HDL category, and it's going to be a variation, and you do have to look at subspecies and the different proteins that are associated with the HDL. Finally, well, maybe not quite finally, I think my second last point here is going to be that HDL and macrophages, they have a thing going, okay? So I love macrophages, and that's how I got interested in HDL because, yeah, macrophages, they have a thing going with HDL, and they have a really tight relationship there in immune defense, in tissue repair. And what happens is that they exchange a lot of proteins and lipids between them. And this has been documented. We've seen macrophages exchange different lipids and proteins with HDL back and forth. And this helps regulate the macrophage's response to inflammation. So very important. And as we noted earlier, we talked about the proteins on HDL that are involved with, complement activation, right? And proteinase inhibitors and the acute phase reactant proteins that are on HDL. And so essentially, I think we should be seeing HDL as a component of the innate immune system. It really is part of the innate immune system. I know we've been thinking about HDL primarily from the viewpoint of cholesterol, boring. And it is important in the sense that it regulates immune function through those lipid domains, for example, okay? But really, HDL has a much wider role than just lipid metabolism. And the final thing that I think we should consider today is the question of what is HDL? Okay, and at this point you might be thinking, okay, she's gone on for 40 minutes about HDL, and now she's asking the question of what is HDL? Yeah, because I don't think we've actually spent a lot of time in the medical world thinking about this at all or discussing this. We've just thought of HDL as just this kind of homogeneous category, the good cholesterol, right? We have the bad guys, the LDLs, and the good guys are the HDLs, as if they were homogeneous, the lipoproteins were homogeneous. And it turns out that, it's not so difficult to study LDLs, but it's really, really hard to study HDLs because of their range and diversity. Generally, the way that we kind of isolate HDL is to centrifuge the heck out of it, okay? So we place it in a centrifuge, ultracentrifuge, and we do that for, 2 days, up to 98 hours. So long periods here in the centrifuge. And the problem with that is that we kind of strip the proteins and the lipids and, these lipoproteins apart. And then once we finish that process, we let it settle. And now the proteins and lipids kind of reassociate randomly. And we think that's what we see in our blood. And that's just not so. It's not true. Okay? So even the way that we have studied HDL has been suspect. Not very good way to actually isolate and categorize HDL. And, if you look into people who study lipoproteins and also EVs, extracellular vesicles, okay, you'll note that a lot of their research, a lot of their conferences, a lot of their discussion is on, well, how do we tell them apart? How do we know this is not a lipoprotein? How do we know this is not an EV? And how do we separate them? And how do we categorize them? And how do we isolate them, right? That's like a lot of their time. And so, you start to figure that, oh, this is a complicated issue and people are having a hard time just even kind of isolating these lipoproteins and categorizing them. Okay, so there are different ways, and we can look at charge, we can look at density, we can look at size, but that adds to the complexity because these are all different ways that people use to measure HDL. And, when we talk about HDL, then we're just comparing apples to oranges. And there isn't like a standard way to look at HDL. I think now researchers are starting to just kind of try to look at mass spec and identify, again, like you saw earlier, the proteins and classify them according to proteins. They've also used antibody assays. Now, when you use antibodies to look at HDL proteins, now you come up with a lot more proteins, just hundreds of proteins, right? And this complexity has led to researchers realizing that, okay, HDL might not be what we thought they were. And in essence, HDL, we think of it as a lipid transporter, and maybe it's more a protein transporter, and that it's transporting proteins and also providing a platform almost for protein-protein complexes to form and protein-protein interactions to form. Okay, so there's a lot about HDL that we still do not know. And which is kind of funny because when I'm in the medical world, everybody talks about it like it's a done deal. It's HDL. And you talk to researchers who've spent their whole lives studying this, they're just at the very beginning, right? And they're still trying to categorize the HDL and figuring out the functions of HDL. There are HDLs that are just ApoA1, no lipid at all, no lipids in them, okay? And that's an HDL. And then you have HDLs that don't have ApoA1, right? And that's also HDL, right? So you can see how diverse that category is, and we don't really know what the heck HDL is, right? So that really adds to the complexity of the problem. Okay, time for our wrap up. I hope I remember what I talked about. I think we started off just by quickly reviewing HDL and, talking about its cardioprotective function. It's seen as an effluxer of cholesterol from the periphery and particularly the artery wall. So it traffics cholesterol back to the liver for excretion. And we think of it as cardioprotective that way. However, there's a U-shaped curve in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease. And it turns out that if you have very low levels of HDL-C, then that's bad. You have higher risk for cardiovascular diseases. But if you have very high levels, greater than 80 or 90 milligrams per deciliter, then you're also at very high risk. And this is also true for the infectious component, your risk for infectious diseases and autoimmune diseases. At very low levels, you have increased risk for those things. At very high levels of HDLC, you also have increased risk for autoimmune disease and infections. So this was very puzzling to a lot of people. And we then talked about HDL having different anti-atherogenic properties. Amongst them, its antioxidant ability, where with the peroxinase enzymes that are associated with HDL, we have a lot of good antioxidant effects and regulation of vascular tone, so that we have increased nitric oxide and vasodilation, and also increased repair of the endothelial wall. And when we have things like autoimmune disease, we actually have decreased antioxidant effects noted in those patients. We also know that HDL can be involved in the inflammatory response. It can bind via LPS binding protein to LPS of gram-negative bacteria, and it can also bind to LTA from the gram-positive bacteria. And it also can be involved with production of acute phase reactants, so that, we can change the sort of landscape of proteins within the blood in the case of infections, so that we can have a good inflammatory response to help get rid of the pathogen. Now, we talked about how HDL can regulate the immune response in different immune cells. So essentially, we have these lipid rafts on cell membranes, and these lipid rafts are domains in the cell membrane that are particularly enriched with cholesterol. And this is where a lot of signal transduction happens, and a lot of different protein-protein interactions can happen. Now, when we have the activation of toll-like receptors on some of these innate cells like macrophages, in the case of exposure to bacteria or to damaged cells, then what happens is that these toll-like receptors now will cluster in the lipid rafts. If you deplete the cell of cholesterol, then you have less of these lipid rafts, or you don't have stable lipid rafts, right? And so you don't have the clustering of those toll-like receptors, and therefore you would dampen that innate immune response. Now, same thing is true when we look at T-cell response, for example, and that's part of the adaptive immune system. So when you have the T-cell receptors that are stimulated by antigens start to cluster, they cluster again in these lipid raft domains. Again, if you deplete those lipid rafts of cholesterol, then you would not allow for this clustering effect, and then you don't have effective signaling there, and you get no T-cell proliferation, right? So that's how we can actually affect these immune cell responses. And so the ApoA1 and the HDL, they are responsible for removing cholesterol from those cell membranes. And so by doing so, they can actually modulate the immune response in those cells. Then we talked about how in macrophages, macrophages can secrete MPO, which can then lead to the formation of hypochlorous acid or bleach, and this bleach can oxidize HDL. We always talk about oxidized LDLs and how bad they are for you, but it turns out when you oxidize HDLs, that also can have an effect on cardiovascular risk. So here in this case, when you oxidize the ApoA1 on the HDL, then you actually change it in such a way that you block its ability to remove cholesterol from the cells. And now you don't have effective cholesterol efflux, or you have a decreased cholesterol efflux capacity. And as a result, you have more accumulation of cholesterol in those macrophages, leading to the formation of foam cells. Now, we went on to look at dysfunctional HDL, partly from the oxidation and also from modification of its protein content, right? We started to see how important the protein content in the HDL species are. And we talked about, the 4 clusters of proteins that were seen on HDL when analyzed by mass spec. We looked at proteins that were involved with lipid metabolism, proteinase inhibitors, acute phase reactants, and also complement type regulation proteins. And that meant that, HDL function is way more than just lipid transport. We also looked at the effects of how statins could actually modify HDL, and that might be, a pleiotropic effect of statins in some cardioprotection for people. Okay, and it's essentially the small, dense HDLs that seem to be more cardioprotective, right? Rather than the large HDLs. And HDLs and macrophages have a thing going. They have a very tight relationship. They work together. They communicate and, exchange proteins, exchange lipids, right? And this affects the function and the immune response in those macrophages. And finally, we're not even clear what HDL really is. There's a whole lot more work that needs to be done in classifying HDL. And instead of just looking at density or size, we really should start looking at function and protein content, protein interactions, and look at how different contexts and different circumstances modify the protein content in the HDL, because we have seen that in different disease states, we have completely different HDL proteomes depending on the disease state. So our current way of looking at HDL is, naive and simplistic, actually, to be really honest. One day we'll look back on this, maybe, decades from now, and this will be just as crazy as, when people thought that the sun god was angry and covered his face during an eclipse, right? And that's essentially how we're looking at HDL still in the medical world. Right now, at least in the research world, we know that there's a lot more of HDL than just lipid metabolism. It's very much involved in immune function. I actually suspect, and this is just me, I consider HDL part of the innate immune system. So stay tuned if you want to hear more about HDL. I just kind of skimmed the surface because I was winging it. But we could go in depth if you want. Just write to me and let me know. If you have questions, why don't you come to one of the live Q&As? I don't know when the next one is. I'll have to look at my own schedule, and that's on my website, vlmd.com, vyvyanelohmd.com. And as usual, I'm happy to hear from you. Be happier to talk to you during a live Q&A session. and get your questions. And maybe, if there's something you can add regarding HDL, I'd really be happy to hear it. HDL and macrophages, okay? Maybe I'll do an episode on the romance between HDL and macrophages. I think that would be exciting. All right, I think I'm done for today. Signing out now from vlmd Rounds. I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe, and I sing the body electric. Have a good week. Bye.